Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of Political Bark. In this week's episode, I have the pleasure of having an expert in all things Afghanistan with me, and we are discussing the local events in Afghanistan from July up until today especially. I'm interested and curious about the different actors in the conflict, notably Qatar, Turkey, and also Western allies powers.
I think most analysts would agree that after 20 years, billions of dollars spent, it was time for NATO and US forces to pull back. But I think the method and lack of thought that it was done would leave mark on the global order for years to come. Now, one of the obvious consequences of this is that some of the states that are dependent on security guarantees from the US will reconsider their alliances. Taiwan is, of course, an obvious example. Already there's been some movements from China that indicated that Taiwan can no longer depend on the U.S. for its securities, and also Israel that's counts on the U.S. for its security will perhaps take more into its own hands the situation with the Iranian nuclear program. This is certainly a major blunder on U.S. foreign policy, certainly since Mogadishu, some would argue, even back to Vietnam. Now, the reason for this is the utter lack of in-depth analysis and the knowledge of fabric of the nation of Afghanistan. And so that is pretty obvious. It's obvious if you look at the map. Now, a lot of people know that Afghanistan is a difficult country to both control and to occupy and to govern, not least. And some of the reasons is pretty obvious if you just look at the map. First off, it's a pretty isolated country. So if you need supply lines into the country, you need to have a third-party country to have your supplies either flown in or have a nearby base. The terrain is pretty rugged, and the Hindu Kush Mountain is notoriously famous to being able to set up ambush. So hard to navigate and hard to do battles, and a lot of people know that there is Afghanistan is a multi-ethnic country, but few people, consider that it's also a co-ethnic country, meaning that if you look at neighboring countries, basically each of the major ethnical groups in Afghanistan has a sort of a host country, neighbor and host country. So, for example, the Tajiks have Tajikistan right by up north, and the Uzbeks, which is also a tribe in Afghanistan, has, there's a country named Uzbekistan. The Turkmens have Turkmenistan, and even the Pashtuns, which is one of the major tribes in southern Afghanistan. The majority of the Pashtuns actually live in Pakistan, so it's a unnatural border between the Pakistani Pashtuns and the Afghani Pashtuns. And the Hazaras, of course, are, feeling much more related to the Iranians as much as they have the same common language as Iran. So you have all these interests besides, the global interest of China and Russia and, of course, the United States. You have these regional interests being co-ethnics with Afghanistan in the region, in the neighboring countries.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Political Bark. The topic of this week is Afghanistan 2.0. We are going to analyze all things Afghanistan, and together with me, I have the pleasure of having Yusuf Salomonsen from the University of Southern Norway, University of Agder. He is a research fellow there and has published his anthology on violent extremism in the 21st century, looking at international perspectives from Cambridge scholars. In his anthology, he looks into the processes of violent extremism, why violent extremism arises, and what can be done. He has also in-depth analyzed Islam and radicalization, amongst a lot of other things. So welcome, Yusuf. It's a pleasure to have you.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I used to be a student of your mom, and it's a pleasure to be with you at Political Park right now. So
I love this because for those listeners that don't know, the reason, the raison d'être, we will say, behind this podcast is that my mom is a professor in political science, and I grew up discussing politics, debating not only politics but history from a multitude of perspectives, and that's the reason why I made this podcast. So in Norway, some people know my mom, and some people then link me to her and link Political Bark to her. So that's always very nice to hear. She's quite a strict professor, but that's another topic.
One of the best we had. One of the best we have, for sure.
Thank you. So the topic today is Afghanistan, as mentioned, a sad topic, I must say, and that has a lot of a variety of endings we could forecast. Today we are going to analyze the perspective on Afghanistan, looking at outside actors, internally. Not so to mention Joseph, he speaks Persian. He has looked at a lot of local sources, spoken with the people in Afghanistan, been close to the conflict the last months, and throughout time, of course. So I think we can just get into it. Let's start with my first question. Was the Taliban's rapid victory expected in all provinces, or almost all provinces?
Right. Yeah. Afghanistan is really hard not to crack. And there's lots of reasons for that. If you look at geopolitics of Afghanistan, first off, it's bordering lots of major players in international geopolitics. It's bordering China and also Iran. That's only that makes it a strategic place to have influence on. Secondly, its geography. It's really unique that it's so isolated that it makes it really hard to wage any kinds of occupation in terms of supply lines. You need to have a neighboring country. Here was Pakistan that hosts some of the supply lines that went through the area, and in its topography, it's not really designed for conventional warfare. It's really it gives advantage to asymmetrical warfare, to guerrilla warfare. It's right for ambushes, and so it's really hard place to command and control. I would say it's really much easier to occupy than govern, as most as both the USSR and US now has experience. But to answer your question more directly, I would say it was pretty obvious for three blows, as I call it, that happened to the US NATO mission since 2001. Because in the beginning, the war was going pretty good. Most of the country was under NATO control or Afghani control. The transition government was taking root. And then the Iraqi invasion happens. That's the first blow that, U.S. took its eyes off the ball and on its main goals. And a lot of the resources were diverted from Afghanistan to Iraq. That's the first blow. Second blow came in 2004, when the 1964 Constitution was really designed for a monarch, revised and sort of shoehorned for a presidency, and that made an extremely centralized government. Reduced the power of warlords, and the traditional method of governing Afghanistan was really undertailed, and it was a central government was taking place. And the third blow came in 2014. The NATO ended its combat operations. Operation Enduring Freedom was ended, and we went to resolute support. So by 2017, one half of the country was already under Taliban rule. Most people don't pay attention to that. So you need to not go to 2019 or 20, but already in 2017, the writing was on the ground, on the wall, and most analysts predicted that by that rate, Taliban would take over, since they already controlled the half the country in 2017.
Yeah, and most analysts are not the media and are not the general population. That's why many were taken very aback.
That's true. They were.
One question that I received from a listener is why couldn't the Afghan forces better resist the Taliban, given all the US and Western and NATO training that they had received for so many years? Weren't they better equipped? Why wasn't the government also better equipped at handling the army and preparing it?
Right. Yeah, and that's a great question. On the surface, if you look at the numbers, this should really not happen. That's the argument that President Biden used. He was saying that, look at, this is not inevitable that Taliban would take over. They have, Afghan forces have 350,000, not just forces, but probably one of the most well-equipped, with most advanced modern warfare equipment in the region. And the Talibans had 70,000 with mostly AK-47s.
How old were these AK-47s?
Most of them had that. Now they have much more advanced because they took over, most of the NATO and Afghan forces equipment. But before then, they had mostly primitive equipment compared to the, extremely advanced equipment and the numbers. 350,000 to 70,000. But I'll give you seven reasons for the entire collapse of the Afghan army. And it's really a collapse. You can really not call it anything else because it took 10 days for Taliban to start its offensive in August 6th and take Kabul in August 15th. So in 10 days, they took over the whole country. So the 7 reason is that first, there was some bogus reporting on the government forces. So the 350,000 reported Afghan forces was not a standing force. They basically counted all the reserves, all the police force, basically anybody that used with traffic light or had any, uniform on them was reported. So, now we know that it was much, much less than that, than the 350,000. Secondly,
how many approximately would you guess?
I would guess probably not more than 100,000 active duty on payroll, because a lot of them were actually not receiving their payroll in the last 3 or 4 months.
In the last 3 or 4 months, which is a huge problem,
Huge problem, yes. And secondly, the structure of Afghan forces was highly dependent on 3 things. First, U.S. air support, in any operation that they had, the air support would go and thin out the strongholds of Taliban, and then the Afghan forces would come and clean it out. And that didn't, that was removed. They were highly dependent on U.S. intelligence, of troop movements, where to strike, GPS navigation, targeting. That was also removed. And also the tech know-how of how to operate these advanced tanks, these APCs, these modern choppers. A lot of them actually were not well trained to operate it without any assistance of NATO forces.
Yeah.
Thirdly, there was internal conflict and corruption maimed the Afghan forces. The morale was all-time low, and as most of us students of war know, morale is everything. So while the Talibans had, they were fighting, as they were saying, for Jinnah or, their next life and for God and for their, for their country, the Afghan forces were fighting mostly for the money that they didn't receive even. So the morale was low. And the Afghans also used a brilliant tactic of not going to the central cities as you would expect, Kandahar, Kabul, or Mazar-e-Sharif. They went firstly to the rural areas, controlled that under the radar of NATO forces and Afghan forces. And when the time came, these major cities actually choked in terms of supply lines and morale. So when Kabul came, every major suburb and village surrounding Kabul and beyond was taken by Taliban, and so that made a huge impact as well. Sixthly, 5,000 highly trained, war-hardened Taliban fighters were free from through the Doha deal, so they went right back to the fighting.
True. In the early days, they were free.
Yes, and lastly, when you set a date for your troop, pullback, then you really have no leverage to militarily to sort of use it as a tactic to sort of and that was also something that the Taliban used, because they went under the radar until that date, and after that they sort of blossomed and took over the country. Like I said, in 10 days. Quite amazing operation.
And I know a top diplomat from North Africa, and she said that it not only seems, but it's true that in the many provinces, the people were more happy almost to work with the Taliban than they were to work with the local government, because the Afghan government was extremely corrupt. And even with all types of corruption, there's a system, there's a democracy in the corruption, and they didn't actually share the benefits well enough, the Afghan government. That's just through the grapevine, but still that many were okay with the Taliban. Quickly, a side note, what do you think Afghan people think of the Taliban?
Well, Afghan is a highly divided country. So, in any poll that you would have, and basically polling is really hard to do, as you would imagine, in Afghanistan. And a lot of these, I would say, loyalties go through ethnical lines. As you know, the Talibans are mostly, if not all of them, Pashtun origin. So in Pashtun areas like Kandahar and other areas, they have much more support. Of course, they have local support. It's impossible to sort of have a military operation of this magnitude and control the country without any local population civil support. But it's much lower than in areas where either the Tajiks have majority or the Hazaras have majority. And as you know, in Panjshir, they have basically no support, and that was the last bastion that hold out. So it's very varied. But one thing that Afghans really appreciate, I think, if you can call it appreciate with the Taliban, is that at least there is certain order. I was saying in some interviews with shopkeepers that are saying there's no need to close the store after 8 o'clock when it gets dark, because there's order and there's sense of security because the war is ended. In war, as you know, one party gets stronger. Either party, either the bad guys or the good guys, it's good for the local population because that ends war. If there's as a balance of power in a war, then you have perpetual war that continues, and no population really is in favor of that.
Yes. I can only imagine how it feels to grow up in a country with the Taliban being so close. It's almost as if it's a legitimate political party actor in society that is there and that you grow up with. It's we see it from our perspective, of course, atrocities and very strict Sharia, for example, and women's rights, but I think it's interesting to hear about this.
I think a very potent a comparison is to the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, or Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt.
Yes.
Most analysts would say, let's free Egypt, let's give them a liberal system, a democracy, let them have free elections. And as soon as they had elections, the Muslim Brotherhood, I would say pretty much fairly, won the election. And that's why, because they had local backing, they years of charity work, years of work, schooling, even hospitals, and same thing what's happened with Hamas. The West pushed for election in the Palestinian territories, and Hamas wins the election, and then we're like, wow, surprised. And that's because these extreme groups, a lot of them have also another aspect of them that's really not covered in the media when they do these local civic work throughout the years that harvest these loyalties for the local population.
Very interesting. Okay, on to more global players. Will Russia, China, and Iran try to make geostrategic gains vis-a-vis the US in Afghanistan and the joint region right now? Can the US still work with them on Afghanistan?
Yeah, that's a great question. And allow me to take it, really briefly, one by one. I think Russia, in short interest, they have a sort of moral boost. They will say, look, we told you so. It's not just the Red Army that, had to cut its ties and evacuate. But in the long term, I was reading some of the Russian newspapers and Russia Today. I was watching that they were saying in the long term, it's not in Russia's interest, since it was good for U.S. to be bogged down in Afghanistan. Maybe it was not that much for troops at the end, but anyway, politically, U.S. is suffering from the Mogadishu syndrome, the Iraqi syndrome, and there was maybe not much more appetite for U.S. to engage in other countries as long as they were occupied in Afghanistan. China, I think, has a much more pragmatic, business-like approach to that. They will even now in the last 2 weeks, they try to use their well-known debt traps diplomacy, where they give generously huge amounts of loans in exchange for strategic infrastructure like railways and roads. And so I think the main strategy of China is to have another partner for their Belt and Road Initiative, which Afghanistan might be a good player for that. And the only concern they have is towards their minority Muslim Uyghurs to the borders of Afghanistan. And that has been part, meaning that Taliban spokesman or leader Mullah Baradar was saying a few days ago that in no way will Afghanistan encourage or interfere in China's affair with regards to Muslim minorities. So they have assurances that they will not engage in that. And besides that, I think that China also appreciates not having NATO forces next door in Afghanistan.
Yes.
And when it comes to Iran, I think Iran really took its eyes off the ball in regards to Afghanistan the last few years. I think Iran's strategy was westward. I'm not talking about Western countries, but west as in Syria, Iraq, and Bahrain, and strengthening the Shia crescent vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia. So now they had to sort of have the bare minimum when their outgoing foreign minister Zarif just had 2 months ago a meeting with Mullah Baradar and basically had two demands or requests. One of them was, of course, secure the minority Shiites or the Hazaras, that they would not suffer any. And that has actually been, to a large degree, until now at least, they have abided by that promise. And secondly, I think, if you look at the project for New American Century back in the Bush days, that they had crowning jewel of Cheney and Wolfowitz and also Zalmay Khalilzad, which was part of that group, was that you will have two major base of operations surrounding Iran, one in Iraq, in 2003, and 2001 in Afghanistan, because the crowning jewel would be Iran, and then you would have two major bases close by Iran for a possible Iranian invasion of Iran. And I think Iran is really happy that, in large degree, U.S. forces have left Iraq and now also leave Afghanistan is a major victory for Iranian security concerns.
But should we be surprised at the U.S.'s self-isolation in the conflict?
What do you mean?
In terms of the U.S. Leaving, in terms of the U.S. Letting others do more or less what they want in Afghanistan?
Well, that has been the case since, I would say, 2001. Imagine, just pick up I think most obvious example of that is the Iraqi war. Iran waged 8 years of war with Iran, 1 million of both sides killed, with one objective: to replace the Ba'athist Sunni government of Iraq with a Shiite government. And the U.S. basically did that for them in 2 weeks. And I'm putting it's a pointed statement here, but I think it took much more time than that. So, yes, the globe, the U.S. footprint in the Middle East, lacking, intrinsic knowledge of the fabric of Middle East, how politics is really cross the borders, it's done, and lacking these understandings really has played in favor of most of these rogue states or axis of evil, as Bush would call them.
Absolutely, I completely agree. I think it's extremely hard for a Western country or power to do anything of great significance in the Middle East, because it's very hard to understand, even for people living there themselves, with all of the different institutions and police and army and secret police. So small question, why were Western forces then allowed to evacuate peacefully? I think sometimes the media gives us the impression that anyone who is in the Kabul right now is in great danger. Many are, of course, but we still saw planes. We still see some planes now. We see, what I notice is that Turkish Airlines and Qatar Airlines, they are flying quite normally in and out. I think they evacuated yesterday American soldiers.
Yes, well, that's also a great question. I would actually argue that probably NATO member state citizens or that are in Afghanistan are probably the safest people in Afghanistan right now. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you a reason for that. First off, the obvious part is that it's part of the Doha deal. One of the main ingredients of the Doha deal was that the Taliban would leave NATO forces and NATO member state citizens and allies be, and otherwise the deal wouldn't go through. But more important than that, there is a huge difference, I think, our Western audience don't understand about the difference of ideology of Al-Qaeda and Taliban. Al-Qaeda is a global ideology. It knows no borders and basically wages a global jihad, as they termed it. To first off, first objective was remove the U.S. forces from the Holy Land, meaning Saudi Arabia, and then ultimately have a global agenda. But the Taliban has exclusively local agenda. So they realized that having NATO forces present in Afghanistan would make it for them impossible to govern effectively whole Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. So for them to lay low and not attack any NATO forces and let them be and let them leave is actually in their interest. So that's those 2 points, the Doha deal and Taliban's main interest.
But there were still attacks. Suicide bombers, I think, at the airport.
Well, that was not Taliban, as you know. That was ISIS-K. And ISIS, just as Al-Qaeda, has a global, they will hit Western targets anywhere they know. And it was their last chance because, they would move, and otherwise they wouldn't have to move to France or Germany or Europe to harm NATO forces. So right before they left, they did this last minute operation, sadly, but that was not at all, and was condemned by the Taliban.
Yes. It was a strange position to be in. one group condemning the other. But another question again about the Doha talks is that in the Norway, for example, many say, oh, but the US, you just left Afghanistan, you pulled out, and Taliban took over everything, and that was a coward move, etc. We should have stayed longer. What about the women's rights, etc. But during the Doha talks, where Western countries were present, heads of state, US, the Taliban were negotiated with, or not negotiated with directly, but it was clear that the Taliban was going to take over the Afghan government. Where was the Afghan government? Where is the Afghan government?
Yes, and actually that's a very, pointed question and has a lot of insight in it. Even though President Biden and others were saying as late as 2 months ago that's almost impossible for Afghan forces to fall, in international politics, you should always not listen to the rhetoric, but see what actually happens on the ground. All of the major actors, NATO, Iran, China, all of them, past 2 years excluded the Afghan government and exclusively negotiated with Taliban. What does that tell you? It means that, they knew that Taliban was de facto in power in a very short time, and there was no point at all to negotiate with the Afghan government. And that's happened in 2020, even 2019 talks.
Yes.
And actually, they had no party whatsoever. So I was talking to one of the officials, of the Afghan officials in the Department of Defense, and he was saying that we had to talk to third-party officials to hear about the contents of the Doha talks, or even media outlets. So we were not even part of
very humiliating, though, for the Afghan government. I mean, it's just they were not even informed of what was happening.
No.
But I mean, from the inside, is it very bad managed? Is there a lot of corruption? What's going on inside the Afghan government?
Exactly, and it's not. It was the only problem was not just corruption, but it was total lack of legitimacy on the ground
with Afghan locals.
With the Afghan locals, because in Afghanistan, anybody that has any sort of legitimacy has sort of jihadi, not from the mujahideens that fight against the USSR, and the closest thing you had, Ashraf Ghani was the academic. He was much more known in Denmark, actually, in Harvard, than he was in Afghanistan, and most of these people were, especially living actually in Europe or US before they came, so they had very little understanding of today's Afghanistan. Yeah. And as I was saying, the only entities that had any sort of control of Afghanistan was the warlords. Marshal Dostum, Ismail Khan, and Muhammad Atanur. All these were sidelined, they were marginalized, and the central government extensively, year by year, centralized the government to Kabul, and I think that was one of the major factors.
Issues. It's very interesting to hear. A makeshift government. And what about the fact that the women's position, especially interesting for women listeners and all listeners, media emphasizes that Western retreat will have detrimental consequences for women. We are seeing bits of that every day now. Taliban promised, said they will stick to firm Sharia that does not endanger women to a great extent, not like before, I guess. What's your take on this from local sources, from Afghan people in Afghanistan? If you know women, I don't know if you have contact with women there, but
yes, what's certainly what they promised in early August 16, with that famous press conference of Mujahid, and it's versus reality now in September. On face value, at least, it's night and day. They basically have not delivered on any promise they said. So, one by one, first factor, press freedom. Tulu News, which is probably the biggest independent news agency in Afghanistan, and also Aryan News, both of them report that their broadcast has been limited. What they are able to broadcast has been limited. Their female journalists has been limited, barred from certain events to covering certain events. When it comes to women issues, there's quite a few things we've seen. First off, first thing we saw was that the universities were parted, gender, segregated universities. Female sports were totally disallowed, banned. Female journalists, as I mentioned, were hindered to doing their work, and we have seen state violence towards protesters that have been in Kandahar and Kabul. But I think the most tangible, most long-lasting effects is the configuration of the new interim government in Afghanistan. First thing they did, they removed the Ministry of Women Affairs. That's the first political move they did. And then they said there's no woman being capable of having any ministerial or leadership positions. And so it's an exclusive government of one gender, only male ministers they have. One tribe, even 95% of their ministers are Pashtun. And also one sector government, meaning basically 96% of their ministers are clergy. So where are the Afghan technocrats? Is another. So it hasn't been that long to have a fair assessment of the Taliban governing methods, but suffice to say, what we've seen for now, it's not at all promising from any of these fronts: press freedom, women issues, or anything.
Not in the sense that we most would like to see, also, but at the same time, there's a lot of people, not only in the Arab world, but many Eastern societies that do accept and sometimes prefer also a society with very strict Sharia, where the women has a very special position with a interpretation of Islam that is very strict, and as sort of the days of the Prophet, for example. Many are gravitating towards that also. So it's, I don't know, how popular do you think such a Pashtun
I
government can be?
Well, as you say, there is some sort of what we say support for that sort of government, even among Afghan females. There was a gathering in the University of Kabul just yesterday. 100 or 200 of Afghani women that were shouting, "We don't want democracy. We don't want, involvement."
We laugh, but
and they're, they are they don't represent, of course, in all Afghans or even majority of Afghan females, but they are an integral part of the Afghan society. So, yes, they for sure have some legitimacy, and of course, it would be a wild and unrealistic, and I would say a crazy idea that you would sort of impose a sort of a European Belgian style gender equality agenda in Afghanistan. It really simply doesn't work and doesn't have a sort of backing in the local population at all.
But with the Soviets, there was a lot more liberation for women.
Yes, well, during the communist rule, different. They had. But what happens always when with this imposed sort of, either you call it liberation or I would just call it governance, to be apolitical, they don't last. So they would last 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years in this case. During those 20 years, Afghan women, according to Constitution, had basically more rights than any Muslim country, save maybe Turkey. So they had Afghan ministers that were, you had, the Ministry of Women Affairs, and you had all this stuff. But as long as it's naturally, I would argue at least, naturally, organically grown in a society, as long as it's sort of imposed, it will not last. As soon as you leave, and it's the same thing happened with the communists. When the Afghans supported the communist, government of Afghanistan was supported by the USSR. As soon as USSR left, that government also collapsed.
Yes. But I mean, this is what the Soviet Union did in many parts of the world, but also when it retreated, then went back to something else. And President Erdogan, bringing this a bit to Turkey and foreign players, President Erdogan says that he desires a soft transfer of power in Afghanistan and stresses the need for the Taliban not to repeat the same mistakes as before, and to act with understanding in regards to all ethnic groups, keep their promises. What's the relationship between Turkey and Afghanistan and the Taliban? Do you have insider knowledge of Erdogan's commitment or partnership with the Taliban?
Well, first off, we should consider, the neo-imperial ambitions of Erdogan, this neo-Ottoman project that he has had from some time. And if that needs to be realized, at least strengthened on that path, he needs to first off project power. If you remember back, 10 years ago in Davos, put down his notes and he was arguing with the Israeli minister and left it, and that was made mostly to project that now it's Turkey that's taking the banner of fighting against Zionism. So they have to project power. That's one thing. They have to also be involved to sort of secure their main interests. The main interests of Turkey are the Uzbeks and Turks that are co-ethnics with the Turkish people, and they have received some security guarantees. For example, General Dostum was expressly told by the Turkish army that, lay down your arms, do not make a huge fuss of that. We will take care of the Uzbeks, and we will for sure make a way for you to have perhaps some power in the future. But they have, they would certainly lose face if they couldn't secure, especially their co-ethnics being the Uzbeks and the Turks. And as far as foreign policy concerned, as you know, the 2015 EU deal is in its last legs. And it's really weakened. Turkey threatened lots of times, especially likely in February, to pull out the entire deal. Since just a repetition, what the EU-Turkey deal was. Turkey was to secure its border, number one. Number two, return every irregular migrant from the Schengen countries back to Turkey, and then receive two things: $5 billion US,
Yes.
and accession talks would be resumed, and that sort of derailed as soon as it started because of the Gulen uprising. That's another issue.
Yeah.
So Turkey is also using that to sort of jumpstart that deal, so for to make it EU deal 2.0.
Oh, really?
For the Afghanistan, and there's been certainly some cables and talks, and if you look at Turk TV, even CNN Turk yesterday was talking that, those $5 billion were for the Syrians, so there needs to be another $5 billion.
Yes, I mean, this is the classical Erdogan move. Very good at using his comparative advantages and creating situations where he has a full-on advantage to European state leaders, or Merkel. Let's say when he says he would open the door for millions, in this case, I guess, the refugees from Afghanistan. How plausible is that, actually?
Well, yeah. Just 2 days ago, he used, back in 2016, he used that famous line, we will flood EU with migrants. Now he said Turkey will not be migrants' warehouse.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, but how likely is that the Taliban would allow an exodus of Afghans also?
That's also I would say there's basically three reasons that, 2015 will not happen. Mm-hmm. One is that we do, albeit weakened, we do have a deal in place. That deal officially is in effect. Secondly, EU border is much more closed than they were before. Right-wing governments have been, coming power in Austria.
COVID also.
Yes, also that there's some mechanism there. There's election in Germany, and the last polling I read is that Alternative for Deutschland was supposed to receive 100 seats in the Bundestag. Secondly, Frontex has been receiving major upgrades and revisions since 2015. So Frontex is much more secure. There's much more. So the borders are much more closed. And lastly, geographically, just if you look at the map, Afghanistan is much more far away than. So they have to cross a lot of closed borders. Turkey has its borders really closed. Iran has it closed. Russia has it closed.
And I mean, no way that Erdogan would allow millions of Afghans to enter Turkey and then risk them not leaving again. But he uses it. He uses it anyways. I think this is again the issue, that the West doesn't always understand what's going on the ground, what the mentality is like, and what the sort of fake news are all about. I mean, Erdogan knows what he's saying. Does Merkel understand it now? Second time around, that his closing migration door is not a reality, is threats, etc. I think that's
you can say a lot of things against Erdogan, but he's brilliant on seizing any event. Yes. Just look at Fatila, these Palestinian boats that were coming. That he was suddenly this knight in shining armor that was saved these boats that were giving supplies to these poor Palestinians. So
a genius.
He's an expert on that, yes, for sure.
He's really good, the strategist. Very quick also. I bet he has a good team also working with him. And so do you think then, in any way, that the Turkey and Erdogan care about, let's say, women's rights in Afghanistan, or because they've never talked about that explicitly? They've just said that the West needs to keep a conversation going somewhat with the Talibans, unless the country will close off, something which Qatar also has said, and that this is the way forward. If we isolate Taliban, that will lead to only instability.
Well, I would, in defense of Erdogan, for one sake, I would defend them. I would argue that basically no major power has women's rights or any of these soft issues, important issues, but in terms of realpolitik and realism, these are not major considerations when they are making global decisions as of which party to support and not support, and certainly not Erdogan, that has curtailed much of women's rights in his own country.
But in the West, for the people, at least
for internal consumption, yes. For internal consumption, yes. Especially Europe has sort of flagged with this nation building, women's rights, and that's important. But mostly the good work that has been done on the important issue of gender equality, especially in Afghanistan, I would argue it has been happened by NGOs more than governments.
Yes, of course. And Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani of Qatar says security and socioeconomic progress will depend on engagement with the Taliban. So earlier we said that during the Doha talks, the West has maybe not directly, but has negotiated with the Taliban, has spoken in some way to the Taliban. Where are the heads of states of Europe now? What are they doing? Are they talking with Taliban? Are they thinking of a plan on how not to let Afghanistan slip into a very unstable form of governance? Do you know anything about the forecasting? What will the West do, the US?
Mostly, if you look at the signals that have coming from mostly from Germany and France, has been that they have a wait-and-see approach. So they're cautiously sort of not making any major announcement, either in condemnation or support or recognition.
Surprise the
well,
West.
yes. But when it comes to, I think it's much more interesting when it comes to Qatar. First off, as you know, Qatar is a major U.S. strategic partner. The camp in Doha, the Al Udeid forward base, is the biggest and most important, with 10,000 troops stationed there already. And the engagement of the Qatar government with the Taliban actually started with the request of U.S. back in 2011, when high-ranking freed asylum, Taliban from Gitmo, from Guantanamo, were actually placed in Doha. The U.S. requested Doha in 2013 to construct a Taliban political office. For them, that's what the office that they've been used in 2013. But if you look at it broadly, House of Thani has this idea that Qatar has to be transformed into this Geneva of Middle East, for lack of a better term. Be modern, capable, isle of stability, and they have several initiatives to sort of realize that. Of course, one major is Al Jazeera. And smaller initiatives is PSG. Just look at PSG, Paris Saint-Germain, with Messi and Neymar and Mbappe on team. They're poised to win, the whole Champions League, and of course the bidding of FIFA World Cup 2022.
Yes.
But Qatar has one major problem with this sort of approach. It's that its own system is an absolute monarchy. Right. So in terms of Afghanistan's previous government, a liberal democratic Afghanistan, with U.S. said that should be a model from the Muslim world, was a threat to, I would say, to the monarchy that had. So I would say Taliban is a much more safer bet for the internal politics of Qatar also. Than a sort of Western-style liberal democratic Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. I think the Emirates of Afghanistan is much more appealing to Qatar than a Republic of Afghanistan.
Yes. And what about Qatar's links to Wahhabist groups and terror groups, Muslim Brotherhood, ISIL, etc.? How does Qatar support the Taliban, for example? Does it? Their support of Afghan is well known. Their main ideology of I wouldn't call it Salafist, but at least a Wahhabist ideology is well known. But they're using that not in a religious ideological sense. I would argue that they're using it much more as a nationalistic approach to both riding two horses at the same time, both projecting this image of moderation to the west of Qatar, but also projecting a pious Islamic emirate sort of for the Muslim population. So they're, and I would say in large they're being successful. Yes.
On that.
So a new Taliban government, if I can call it, needs to be able to talk through Qatar, for example, with the US. Do you think the US Biden will ever speak more directly? Do you think European heads of states will? I mean, we do talk with Hamas, Palestine.
For sure. And First off, we've had, U.S. has had direct, not third-party, direct negotiations with the Taliban. So President Trump himself
yes,
directly talked with Mullah Baradar, Zalmi Khalilzad, directly talked with Taliban leadership, and that will continue. And I think Secretary Blinken just a few days ago was saying that Qatar would be a major host for these talks. So I think that role that Qatar has had in the past will continue. I think so, yes.
So on the other side, another very important actor that we haven't talked enough about or mentioned, Pakistan. What's Pakistan's role and what is Pakistan interested in Afghanistan? Some say that Pakistani army or military has been working with the Taliban in order for the whole takeover to go faster, etc. What's your take on Pakistan?
I think here is really important to know two important contextual historical facts. First off, Pakistan, being a construct of recent history in 1948, sees everything from its geopolitical lens, as any country does. And for Pakistan's national security, only one thing matters, and that's India. So when you consider that, back in the 80s, National Defense University of Pakistan argued that Afghanistan should be used as something they call strategic depth, meaning that if you had at least a friendly government there, that in case of an India invasion, Pakistani forces could sort of move out, as Taliban has done with the with NATO forces, and that's one of the main reasons I would say NATO has not been able to defeat the Taliban, is that they had a safe house in Pakistan. That's established beyond any doubt. But they would have the same thing in Afghanistan if they had a Taliban government in place. And a Taliban government, of course, would be much more hostile to India than a Republic of Afghanistan would be. And as we've seen, Ashraf Ghani has visited the BJP party, and they've had close ties with India in the last 20 years. So that's the national interest of Afghanistan, of Pakistan, to have at least a friendly government, but also what they call a strategic depth. That they can have a fallback point in terms of a conflict with India. But in terms of specifics, what operations, some are arguing that Panjshir, there's been some drones attacking. I wouldn't disregard that, but I wouldn't say that's certainly happening, because there's so much misinformation happening that we can really establish that as a fact. But one thing is a fact, that the U.S. funded the Mujahideen and Al-Qaeda through Pakistan. So most people are aware that when the Red Army was in place, there was a strategic device calling Green Belt, meaning that you have a Muslim force sort of curtailing the Red invasion of USSR, arming the Mujahideen, and through the Haqqani network, arming Al-Qaeda. We know that. But what's important is that always happened exclusively through Pakistan, army, and through the ISI. And when that abruptly ended in 2001, when suddenly the message from the U.S. administration was that cut all ties with these people, some elements within the Pakistani government, and especially army, which is a separate sort of entity in Pakistan that's sort of self-governing outside the politics of Pakistan, they refused. So they disagreed with that. So some elements, if you call it, at least some rogue elements, continue to have ties with these parties. Yes.
I mean, the general red line here, or general trend, is that all actors involved are very much involved in a real political way. Only national interest is what matters. Which then brings us to NATO's role and the reputational damage that has been caused among voters and general population. Many thousands were sent to Afghanistan. Military suffered PTSD, many died, and then get the message that the US pulls out, and that's it. This is, of course, a huge blow for many people and many who lost their loved ones. What do you think of the way politicians, let's start in Norway, have reacted to the abrupt, or at least in most people's opinion, quick retreat from Afghanistan, and have we as a society then let down our soldiers and their families?
Yes, and let's just land firstly some hard numbers here. Some of them are known, some of them are actually less known. At the peak of this, we had more than 110,000 NATO forces in Afghanistan. More than 40 countries, major countries, were involved. 50,000 Afghan military forces died, and as you know, 3,500 NATO forces. There's some dispute about numbers of how much was spent. If you have a conservative estimate, it's $1 trillion. If you count, the veteran veteran care and all that, it'd be about close to $2 trillion was spent. And when it comes to Norway, you mentioned Norway, we had about 10,000 soldiers in Afghanistan. 10 of them got killed. 9 of them were part of NATO forces, and 1 of them actually were under UN command. 1 female. Just to put that in, Norway's mission, basically what we called, Trene, veilede, operativ støtte, in Faryab province was mainly a success in that limited sense. But what really amazes me is that NATO has a extremely competent analytical units that in a daily basis, sort of analyze geopolitical situations. None of these institutes or units were consulted even. So it was mainly a political decision that was carried out unilaterally by US. So I wouldn't blame the Norwegian government, but the NATO as the institution should have had a council on this. They should have discussed that. I think most actors, as I said earlier, that agreed after 20 years, if not this year, maybe in 5 years' time, the mission would be a failure and you need to have a pullout. But the sequencing of it, that's the problem. How on earth, that's what they learn you in any military class, military strategic class, that first you move out soft targets, then hard targets. Military assets will be evacuated lastly, not firstly, as the sequencing was a big problem. So a lot of this has to do with the NATO capacity in Brussels was not mobilized whatsoever, especially the strategic and warfare analysis that was totally lacking in this regard.
I mean, it was consulted. It was there, but it was not listened to.
Yes, of course, yes.
I would disagree just for the fact that, because I think all governments have their say. Yes, we are part of big alliances, NATO, the EU, but we still have a say, and politicians can take more responsibility in national governments to say something and disagree. It doesn't always have to be the US or the highway. I
agree, and they did that in 2003. If you remember, the Iraqi invasion, a lot of the actors, especially France, were taking a leading role to arguing against, is there a weapons of mass destruction? Is there a link between Al-Qaeda and Iraq? And making their case. So, supposing you lose your case and you go with your mandate as NATO, but nobody even rose up. Any EU leader rose up and signaled the alarm of this disastrous pullback.
And just my last comment then is, since the US clearly has moved resource-wise, military strategy-wise somewhere else, where are they looking? Where's the US looking? What's next? Because this is a pop question. Because China is an economic threat growing. We see sort of a multipolar world. Power has shifted. I mean, if the US is out of Afghanistan this quickly, where are they headed? Where are they needed next?
I think the national interest of U.S. has been what has been flagged by Obama in his administration. He called it the Asian pivot back in the day. I think that's where the activity is. That's where the economic growth is. Even big technological centers of the world is sort of slowly but surely moving from Silicon Valley to parts of the Far East. So that's my guess, but nobody knows, you know. And another thing with the U.S. foreign policy in the last days is that last years has been that generally you have had a consensus on that on both parties. You know, you had the dovish approach, the hawkish approach, but now it's basically you have a divergence of foreign policy. For example, Iran deal, one party signs it, another party comes in and totally rejects the deal, and then the third administration comes in and tries to revise that deal again. So U.S. foreign policy is a sort of a state of disarray, I would say. And that happens always when you have a decline of a major power. When you go from a sort of a bipolar to unipolar and now to a multipolar reality, these things happen, and it takes some time to cement that general.
I very much agree. Interesting forecasting. So what would be your advice to anyone following the Afghanistan conflict and situation ahead now in terms of interpreting what's coming out in the media? How should we look at things? What should we focus on? You know, if we want to be ahead in understanding the conflict the best way.
Two things. First, you know, do not listen to any party's rhetoric. Look at the things on the ground. Actual legislation, actual motions put in place, who's in power, the demographics of the government, that sort of thing. Secondly, we've lost all our leverage. Basically, when you don't use gunboat diplomacy, which is what I would argue it works in countries of that region. You set a date for your evacuation and then go negotiate. You should have negotiated in 2011 when you had 11,000 soldiers there. Yeah. The only thing you are left for all of us is a pressure of maximum pressure and vigilance. Because one thing that there was two things that Taliban wanted. One of them they already got. It's the evacuation of what they call foreign occupants from Afghani lands. That happened. Second is international recognition. There's no way to sort of govern. Like I said, it's really easy to occupy Afghanistan and even control, but to govern Afghanistan is close to impossible. And that's makes it even much more impossible if you have no international recognition, if you're not permitted to trade and to engage with the international community. So we should, sort of hold that last wish or, of the Taliban to closely be vigilant of what they're doing, and then go either way of letting them in the international community or having a total isolation and the sanction and boycotts.
But that will depend a lot on what the other actors are doing outside Western actors, how they negotiate with the Talibans.
Yes,
and
for sure. So there's lots of.
They're not going to ignore them. So.
As Donald Rumsfeld would say, there are a lot more unknown unknowns in this case.
Yes,
so,
yes.
So
thank you so much, Yusuf. It was great. I think all listeners will really enjoy this in-depth and multifaceted list of points and perspectives that are so useful to know. So this is a really good recap of what's happening now. Maybe we'll do another episode once we see how the conflict evolves and how other stakeholders are behaving.
Thank you, and thank you for your insightful questions. That really made made for an interesting discussion. So I appreciate that.
Thank you for joining Political Bark.